If you thought the AI race was just about who builds the smartest chatbot, think again. Because one of the biggest AI fights of 2026 is not OpenAI versus Google, or Claude versus ChatGPT, it's Pentagon versus Anthropic. And at the center of it is one question that is going to define the next decade of technology. Who gets to decide what frontier AI is allowed to do in war, surveillance, and national security? According to Anthropic, the US military wanted broader access to Claude for any lawful use, while the company refused to remove protections tied to mass domestic surveillance and fully autonomous weapons. Then things escalated fast. Public statements, threats, a supply chain risk label, and finally a federal push to stop using Anthropic technology. And that is what makes this story so explosive. Because this is not just a business disagreement. This is not just another AI policy argument. This is the moment when the shiny consumer AI era collides head-on with the reality that the most powerful models on Earth are now strategic assets. Not just for coding, not just for search, not just for content generation, but for intelligence analysis, operational planning, cyber operations, simulation, and eventually, potentially, the battlefield itself. Anthropic itself said Claude has already been deployed across US national security agencies for mission-critical applications including intelligence analysis, modeling and simulation, operational planning, and cyber operations. So in this video, I want to break down what actually happened, why the Pentagon wanted Claude, why Dario Amodei refused, why this fight matters way beyond Anthropic, and why this may be remembered as one of the first true constitutional crises of the AI era. Because beneath the headlines, this isn't really about one company. It's about the rules for military AI, and whether anyone still gets to say no. The first thing you need to understand is that Anthropic was not anti-defense. In fact, that's what makes this story so much more interesting. Dario Amodei explicitly said he believes in using AI to help defend the United States and other democracies. Anthropic said it was the first frontier AI company to deploy models into US government classified networks, the first to deploy at national laboratories, and the first to provide custom models for national security customers. In other words, this was not a company refusing to work with government at all. This was a company saying, we will work with the military, but not without limits. That distinction matters, because if Anthropic had simply said, we don't do defense, the Pentagon would have shrugged and moved on to another vendor. But that is not what happened here. What happened was much more dangerous for both sides. Anthropic was willing to help, willing to sell, willing to support warfighters. But it drew two red lines. According to Anthropic's own statement, those two red lines were mass domestic surveillance of Americans and fully autonomous weapons. Anthropic said current frontier models are not reliable enough to safely run fully autonomous weapons systems, and it argued that AI-powered mass domestic surveillance is incompatible with democratic values and fundamental rights. That sounds narrow, and that's exactly Anthropic's argument. The company says these are not broad anti-military restrictions. These are two specific exceptions. Anthropic even said that, to the best of its knowledge, those exceptions had not affected a single government mission to date. So if that is true, then why did this become such a massive fight? Because from the Pentagon's perspective, the issue was not what Claude had done already. The issue was whether a private AI company would be allowed to hard code limits into a system the government might want to use later under lawful authority. Anthropic said the Department of War wanted companies to agree to any lawful use and remove safeguards in those two cases. It also said the department threatened to remove Anthropic from its systems, designate it a supply chain risk, and even invoke the Defense Production Act to force safeguard removal. And that gets us to the real conflict. This was not just about one feature in Claude. It was about control. Who controls the final boundaries of frontier AI in national security settings? The elected government? The military chain of command? The contractor? The model developer? The safety team? The lawyers? Or the engineers who build the refusal layers and classifiers in the first place? That is the real story, because in the pre-AI era, a contractor might provide software, hardware, or logistics. But frontier AI is different. AI is not just a passive tool. It is an adaptive cognitive layer. It helps decide what to prioritize, what to surface, what to simulate, what to infer, what to flag, and eventually what action paths look most plausible. Even when a human stays nominally in the loop, the AI can still shape the loop itself. And that is why the red lines matter so much. Take mass domestic surveillance. On paper, that phrase sounds abstract. In practice, it means using AI to fuse gigantic streams of legal but fragmented data. Movement data, web activity, social graphs, public records, location patterns, open source intelligence, maybe even commercial data brokers, and turning it into a persistent, searchable map of people's lives at scale. Anthropic specifically warned that modern AI makes it possible to assemble scattered data points into a comprehensive picture of a person's life automatically and massively. That is a huge shift. Before modern frontier models, mass surveillance was often bottlenecked by analysts, software complexity, query limitations, and human attention. But when you add a model like Claude, suddenly the bottleneck changes. You move from find me this file to interpret this entire population. That is why Anthropic framed this as a civil liberties issue, not just a customer policy issue. Now look at the second red line. Fully autonomous weapons. Again, this sounds futuristic, but the underlying problem is already here. AI is already used in targeting support, drone vision, object recognition, battlefield simulation, and decision assistance. Anthropic did not say all military autonomy is unacceptable. In fact, Dario Amodei explicitly said partially autonomous systems already used in places like Ukraine can be vital to defense. What Anthropic objected to was removing humans from selecting and engaging targets entirely, especially using today's frontier AI, which it argues is still too unreliable for that role. And that point is hard to dismiss, because even the most advanced models still hallucinate. They still misread edge cases. They can still be manipulated, still be jailbroken, still behave unpredictably under stress, still fail in novel environments. Anthropic's own recent safety work emphasizes stronger safeguards, model evaluations, and new defensive techniques against jailbreaks, because current systems are not perfectly robust. It also activated higher-level protections for more capable models under its responsible scaling framework. So when Dario Amodei says, effectively, we are not comfortable letting Claude become the brain of a fully autonomous weapon, that is not just branding, that is a judgment about the current technical state of frontier AI. And here's the uncomfortable part. He may be right technically, even if governments hate hearing it strategically. Because militaries do not like dependency without control. If a government is going to rely on a system for intelligence, planning, or battlefield support, it does not want a vendor saying, yes, but only under our moral interpretation. Governments especially do not like the idea that a refusal layer built by a private lab could suddenly become the hidden governor of national power. That's why this story has echoes far beyond Anthropic. It echoes the old fights over encryption, where governments wanted lawful access and tech companies warned about opening the door too wide. It echoes the social media era, where platforms kept saying they were neutral tools until governments and the public realized those tools were actually shaping society at scale. And now we're watching the next phase. Not move fast and break things, but move fast and weaponize intelligence. And the Pentagon clearly does not want to be in a position where one lab founder can veto a use case it considers lawful and strategically important. But Anthropic's response is basically, legality is not enough. That is one of the most important themes in this entire fight. Anthropic's position is that some uses of AI are dangerous even if they are technically legal under old frameworks that were not built for this level of machine capability. Dario Amodei argued that the law has not caught up with AI's ability to combine massive data into automated surveillance systems. In other words, Anthropic is saying, don't tell us it's legal under rules written for a weaker technological world. That is a radical position in one sense, but also maybe an inevitable one. Because frontier labs now sit in a weird place. They are not governments, they are not normal software vendors, they are not universities, they are not defense primes. They are companies building systems that can amplify analysis, compress timelines, scale monitoring, and influence decisions across entire institutions. That makes them more like geopolitical infrastructure than ordinary startups. And once you become infrastructure, neutrality gets harder to claim. Then the fight escalated even further. After the public clash, the administration moved to phase out federal use of Anthropic technology. AP reported that President Trump ordered federal agencies to stop using Anthropic products after the company's dispute with the Pentagon over AI safety. Anthropic, meanwhile, said any supply chain risk designation would be unprecedented for an American company and said it would challenge such a move in court. That escalation matters for another reason. It sends a message to every other frontier AI company. And that message is simple. If you want government business, especially national security business, you may eventually be forced to choose between selling access and defending constraints. That is where the comparison to OpenAI becomes especially revealing. OpenAI announced its own Pentagon agreement immediately after this dispute blew up, and it emphasized that its deal still contains 3 red lines. No mass domestic surveillance, no directing autonomous weapons, and no high-stakes automated decisions like social credit-style systems. OpenAI also argued that its arrangement has strong contractual and technical protections and that it is not giving the Pentagon guardrails-off models. That creates a fascinating contrast, because on the surface, it looks like Anthropic lost the customer and OpenAI won the contract. But underneath that headline is a deeper possibility. Anthropic may have taken the political hit first, only for its core redline framework to shape the terms of what came next. If OpenAI's public description is accurate, then the post-Anthropic Pentagon conversation is not no guardrails at all. It is now a fight over which guardrails, whose oversight, and how enforceable they really are. So was Dario Amodei principled, naive, strategic, or all three? Probably all three. Principled because he publicly tied Anthropic's stance to civil liberties and reliability, even under intense pressure. Strategic because drawing clear lines can strengthen a brand exactly when the market is deciding which AI labs it trusts with civilization-scale systems. And maybe naive only if he underestimated how aggressively governments react when a contractor appears to challenge sovereign discretion over war and surveillance. But here's my view. This may be one of those moments that looks like a company dispute in real time and like a doctrine-setting event in hindsight. Because 10 years from now, the key question may not be, did Anthropic keep this one contract? The key question may be, who normalized the idea that frontier AI companies are allowed, or not allowed, to embed non-negotiable limits into military deployments? If Anthropic fails completely, then the lesson to the market is brutal. Never challenge the government publicly, never make hard commitments you can't soften, and keep your red lines vague enough to survive procurement pressure. If Anthropic partly succeeds, then the lesson is different. Strong model providers can still participate in national security while refusing a small set of uses they see as catastrophic for democracy. And if that second model survives, it could become one of the most important governance patterns in the AI era, not because it solves everything, but because it establishes that the frontier model itself is not just a product, it is a governed capability. That's the part a lot of viewers miss. This is not only a Pentagon story, it is not only an Anthropic story, it is not only a Claude story, it is a preview of the next wave of fights coming for every major lab: OpenAI, Google DeepMind, xAI, Meta, and whoever comes next. As these systems get more agentic, more autonomous, more multimodal, more embedded in real workflows, and more useful in intelligence and military settings, the pressure to remove friction will only increase. So when you hear the title, Pentagon versus Anthropic, Why Dario Amodei Refused to Let Claude Become a Military AI, don't read it like a personality clash. Read it like an early chapter in a much bigger war over the future of AI power. A war over whether frontier labs can still say, yes, we will help defend the country, but no, we will not turn our model into an engine for mass domestic surveillance or fully autonomous killing. Because once that line disappears, it may be very hard to draw it again. And that is why this story matters so much. Not because Claude already became a military AI, not because Anthropic refused all defense work, and not because the Pentagon suddenly discovered AI. It matters because one of the most powerful AI companies in the world just tested whether it could work with the state without surrendering its final two red lines. And Washington's answer, at least for now, seems to be not on those terms. So the real question is no longer whether governments will use frontier AI. They already are. The real question is whether the companies building that AI will have any meaningful power left to shape how it is used. Or whether, once these models become strategically indispensable, every guardrail will eventually be treated as optional. That is the real fight, and it's only getting started.